Righto, apologies. We've received no apologies for today, though Councillors Moore, Goff and Harrison Hunt are joining us on Zoom. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's information session. Before we start, a reminder that this workshop is being live streamed. However, while the workshop is open to the public, it is for staff to provide guidance to elected members. It is not a forum for debate or decisions. It is also not a forum for the public to provide input into decisions or bring other matters to Council's attention. If a member of public does want to provide input, please talk to staff and we will help you have your say. So now, first one up is dog control policy and bylaw review. So we have Tina, Lionel and Crystal, is that right? Fire away, the floor is yours.
Thanks, everybody. Good morning. So we are bringing this briefing to you today ahead of a report that's coming to you in October, and we briefed your community boards previously earlier in the year about this review, which we've been working on for a while now. So just to set some context, so the policy and bylaw are required by legislation, so it's one of the few bylaws that we must have. And it's a little bit of a different arrangement with the Dog Control Act because we have to have a policy and the policy leads to the bylaw. So we don't normally have to have a policy. It's a different arrangement. And most of the information is listed in the policy, for example, the leashed and prohibited areas, and then the bylaw enables enforcement of that. So it's a slightly different arrangement to a standard bylaw. The review that we're undertaking is required by legislation. So the bylaw, although it's made under the Dog Control Act, is deemed to be made under the Local Government Act. So it has to comply with all of the Local Government Act requirements. And that means that we have to review it at least once every 10 years. This isn't due for review until 2026, but we've brought it forward slightly to coordinate the reviews that we have in Council. We've got 16 different bylaws and we have a 10-year timetable that coordinates the reviews. And we're also doing this a little bit early because things have been changing. So since we last reviewed the bylaw and policy in 2016, all of the former red zone land has been turned back to Council. We've developed extensive engineered stormwater basins, which have good public access and walking tracks in them. We've got parks and new subdivisions. The Council has declared a climate and biodiversity emergency, and we have strategic priorities around protecting and enhancing our biodiversity. We have 5,000 more dogs than when we last did the review. So we have about 45,000 dogs in the district at the moment, which is quite a high number. And community views are always evolving, so it's a good chance to check in with our communities around how they're feeling about dog control. And we've also been putting a lot of work as a council into habitat restoration. So there's quite a lot of changes that have been going on that we need to reflect in the policy. So we're bringing that report to you in October, and that report, as with all bylaws, even if we weren't making any changes, we have to go out for consultation. So that's what will be coming up. So this is quite important context. So the Dog Control Act requires councils to have regard to certain things in looking at its dog control policy. So the first one is the need to minimise danger, distress and nuisance to the community from dogs. So the danger element is easy to interpret. That's sort of attacks and injuries and accidents. Distress is a little bit harder to interpret. That's about how people are feeling and the sense of community safety. And nuisance, in a basic sense, that's sort of frustration or annoyance, but in a health act sense, that's things like noise and smell, so barking dogs, people not picking up after their dogs, that sort of thing. The second thing is the need to avoid the inherent danger in allowing dogs uncontrolled access to public places where there are children. Now, two parts to that, whether uncontrolled access is about, dogs roaming of their own free will, or whether it's that they're not properly controlled by the owner or person in charge. And places where there are children is everywhere. So this applies in all public places, but we do have some specific protections in places that are specifically designed for children. So playgrounds, paddling pools, and skate parks. The third one is the importance of enabling the public to use streets and public amenities without fear of attack or intimidation by dogs. So it's really about how people feel about having dogs in those areas, and that sense of community safety is a big element to it. So we're not just regulating in places where there is evidence of attacks, it's about how people feel, and that's part of why there's a consultation process about this. And the fourth thing that we have to look at is the recreational needs of dogs and their owners. And we have amazing opportunities in this district for people to exercise their dogs. So this, you might be familiar with this, is the dog control map. So this is an interactive map online, and it shows all of the areas where we have specific protections in place. So all of those coloured areas are areas where dogs are leashed or prohibited or have particular rules in place. Anywhere not coloured is either private land, or it means that dogs are allowed under effective control by default. So that means that dogs don't have to be leashed, but they have to be under good control. We have 3 general prohibited categories, so they're not shown up there. So that's, as I mentioned before, playgrounds, paddling pools, and skate parks. And then we have 3 general leashed categories. So that's alongside, on roads and on footpaths alongside roads, and memorials and cemeteries, and in boat ramps and slipways. So, and thinking about, oh, sorry, to go back to that last slide. So we have 155 specified areas, and that sounds like a lot. But if we go to the next slide, we have a lot of different spaces for recreation. So we have over 10,000 hectares of parks in the district, which is quite substantial. We have 109 regional parks. So that's parks in the Port Hills, around Banks Peninsula, the Grasslands parks, Brooklands, around the estuary. There's lots of different regional parks and lots of different scenarios where we dogs might have different rules that apply. We have 1,203 community parks. So in those 62 garden and heritage parks, we might have some restrictions to protect plantings. In the 797 neighbourhood parks, we have very few restrictions in those specifically named parks, although of course we have the protections around playgrounds, and that's just the immediate area around playgrounds. We have 115 sports parks. Some of those you'll know are quite substantial, great areas to exercise your dog in some situations. And we have over 700 hectares red zone land with about 600 in the flat area, which is also available with good public access. And of course, we have all our coastlines and beaches. So we have our sandy east coastline, which has very few restrictions in place other than right at the northern end around Brooklands Lagoon, and around the swimming beaches, which just applies over the summertime. But around the peninsula, we have more restrictions because we've got a lot of wildlife protection, things like blue penguins and seals, but also birds. And of course, we've got some protections around the South Shore and the estuary as well. So there's a range of different areas there, but we've got really great places to exercise dogs. We, as I mentioned before, have all of the stormwater assets. They often look like parks and operate in terms of the public perception as parks, but they manage the stormwater assets. So for example, Te Kuru has about 14 kilometres of walking tracks. So really good public access. And of course, all our roads and footpaths. So they're often used by people in winter in particular, with dogs pop out for a quick walk around the roads. So that's another place where dogs can be exercised. So despite having those 155 specified areas, we do have amazing opportunities for people to exercise their dogs. But some of those areas, of course, have restrictions in place. As I said before, we have nearly 45,000 dogs in the district. So that's about 37,000 owners. So some of those people own multiple dogs. And in terms of a per capita rate, we have 1 dog for every 9 people. The closest comparison is Dunedin. They have 1 dog for every 7 people, but overall they only have about 19,000 dogs, so much fewer dogs than we have. And then the other end of the spectrum is Auckland. They have 115,000 dogs, but they have so many people and over such a large area that only equates to about 1 dog for every 15 people. So we have a high per capita rate of dogs in the district, but we also have a lot of land where they can be out and about, with some controls in place. So we're possible areas where we might be looking at changes or where we're interested in the public's views. We had over 6,000 responses, and I'll just mention before I hand over to Crystal that the Dog Control Act requires us to notify every registered dog owner when we're looking at changing the policy. So we did send that out to the registered dog owners, and we also sent it out to our usual stakeholder channels, but also a lot of specific ones around people that might have an interest in those recreation spaces and how the public places are used. Hand over to you.
So I'll just take you through the results of that survey. So it really was about gathering some ideas of how to think about that. The topic that we're looking at is part of the review. Sorry. So we asked a few questions around.
Sorry, they're all connected. I didn't realize. I thought I was turning off one mic and I was turning off all of them. Sorry, that was me.
So we asked some questions around protecting our wildlife spaces, bird habitats and natural habitats. And we got quite a lot of support from the public, both from dog owners and non-dog owners, about adding in some extra controls for where dogs are allowed in certain spaces. So as you can see there, we had 77% of people say yes, they'd like to see better controls around the estuary. Similarly with the Avon River corridor, so 69% of people said yes, they'd like to see better controls there. And then we also asked a question around our engineered wetlands, and slightly less people felt that we should have restrictions there, but still a really good majority, so 64% of people. We had some questions around leashing on different types of paths. So as Tina said, at the moment, dogs have to be leashed on footpaths that are beside roads. So we've been looking at what types of restrictions may be needed on other types of paths. Since the last bylaw review, we've obviously had quite an increase in shared paths around the city. So there was quite a lot of support from people to have a leash requirement on shared paths, regardless of where that path happens to be. So 76% of people said yes to that one. Then we also asked a question around paths in parks. So this question specified that obviously in parks there would still be space for dogs to be able to run off lead on grassed areas and those sorts of things, as long as they were under effective control. But around whether we should have a leash requirement on those paths that go through parks. So 57% of people said that they would like to see that.
We have that in place in Hagley Park. That was something that we put in the last review, where we acknowledge that those pathways are really busy, and we put a rule in to say that on those pathways you have to have your dog leashed, but in all the other grassed areas you can have your dog under effective control. People were a little bit concerned that that might be confusing or difficult and it wouldn't work in practice, but it's worked really well.
So I guess another reason for these is to try and have some consistency as well. So that was something that a lot of people said in the comments, that it would be nice to have sort of one rule for these types of spaces, so they didn't have to constantly look up what they were allowed to do in specific parks and things.
It will also help future-proof things. So for example, with developing new stormwater basins that have tracks in them, if dogs are required to be leashed on all tracks, then it will apply to new tracks that go in after we make the rules.
So moving on from there, we also asked a question about formed tracks. So tracks that aren't like concreted, but perhaps they're shingle tracks or crusher dust type paths. We got less support from this. As you can see, sorry, it's a little bit hard to see the red there, but we got 44% of people saying yes, and then 49% of people saying no. And we did a little bit of a breakdown by whether people have a dog or not. And as you can see, people who own a dog were far less likely to say yes, with the majority of dog owners saying no. And looking at the questions, the comments for this section, it was quite clear that we have a little bit of a misunderstanding of the current rules. So there was a number of people making comments about the port hills and the use of the port hills and wanting to still keep their dog off lead on the port hills. But the rules are currently that you have to have your dog on a leash on the port hills, and that came in 2016.
Or before for quite a lot of them, so it's been the case for quite a long time.
So there's a need for us to probably communicate that better, and when we go out for further consultation, that'd be one of the things that we look to try and bring through, so that people have a really good understanding of what is already in the bylaw. So we asked a question around control of multiple dogs. So how many dogs one person can manage in a public space. We had 48% of people say yes, they'd like to see us set a limit on the number of dogs someone can manage. There were far more people in this section who said they didn't know, or they weren't sure whether we should. And obviously people who don't have a dog were far more likely to say yes, they'd like a limit set. While you can see that people who have a dog were were more likely to say no than others, dog owners still, a majority agreed that a limit would be good. In terms of what kind of limit, we asked people to give us an idea of what they think a sensible limit would be. And on average, we had people say 2 to 3 off lead and 3 to 4 on lead. And then just wrapping up the last of the results. So we also asked people about whether we should change the definition of under effective control to make it easier to understand. 53% of people said yes, but we had a number of comments in the survey about, what they think would be a better description of under effective control and what words and terms would be more helpful for people to understand it. We also asked a question around short leashes. So where leashes are required, should they be required to be a short leash? 51% of people said yes about that. And then we asked some other questions around leashing in some community spaces. And we had some really good support for leashing on sports fields, not all the time, but just when sports games and sports practices are in place. So 80% of people agreed with that. Community gardens and jetties and wharfs were also, should we introduce leashing on those? And 72% said that yes for those.
So we'll be bringing our report to you in October. I think your notes say the 2nd, but it will be the 16th of October. And that will present in more detail the results of the review that we've been undertaking and proposed consultation. So for the Dog Control Act requires a special consultative procedure. So there'll also be a statement of proposal as part of that documentation that you get. So we have to notify all registered dog owners, as I mentioned, and consult the general public and anyone else that has any interest. So the interest for this can be really broad because it affects all public places and how people feel in them. And of course, we've got over 39,000 people who own dogs and have views. And then we're looking to have hearings after that consultation in 2025, and then we'll come back to council for adoption after that. And that's all we had in terms of the presentation.
Excellent. That's very, very clear. Thank you very much. We've got Victoria, Kelly, then Tim.
Oh, thank you for that. Of the 45,000 or nearly 45,000 dog owners, how many of those is categorised as responsible dog owners in our system?
16,000.
16,000? Yep. Yeah. And I'm interested in the current level of enforcement over the since it was last reviewed. What was it, 2016? How many enforcements have we had? Prosecutions, or how do you gather your data? What are the statistics that we've got in terms of breaches of the bylaw?
So in terms of prosecutions, we average approximately 1 prosecution a year. Other enforcement is classification of dogs as menacing or dangerous. And then we average approximately 1,200 infringements, and I think it's about 600 warnings, which will cover all the enforcements that we would undertake.
And do you have suburb by suburb statistics available?
No.
I was going to say it's probably not as helpful to have suburb by suburb, because it depends whether you'll be looking at where the home of the registered owner is, or whether you'll be looking at where that occurred, and they can be quite different. And I should mention too that the Dog Control Act itself sets a whole lot of obligations on dog owners and rules around dog behaviour, and so the policy and bylaw deal with local and particular issues. So some of the enforcement activity is about the act itself rather than the local regulation through the bylaw.
So when we've chosen a couple of areas that we were concentrating on in the recent review, that'll no doubt come up in the consultation around the red zone and the estuary, have you got statistics for breaches of the policy or data around those 2 key specific areas where you're proposing to make the biggest changes? Because what I'm really interested in is understanding the mandate for the change in terms of what is the problem you're trying to solve.
Yep. So if we go back to that slide on the purpose of what we're required to look at as a council under the Dog Control Act, it's not just about enforcement activity, it's about the sense of community safety and how people feel. And it's also about council's other obligations around things like protecting biodiversity. And some of those things are really hard to pin down in terms of stats. Like people, may say, well, how many attacks have there been to wildlife? we don't know unless we find evidence of it or unless people report it, but that doesn't mean that it's not happening, that we don't have
Yeah, well,
studies and other things
I'm
to show it.
interested in evidence-based decision making, so I'm interested in seeing the statistics that you have got, which are underpinning some of the changes that you're proposing. Where will I find that information?
So we'll bring the full review report to you in October, so that will have more detailed information.
And if you're proposing to extend the bylaw, are you similarly proposing to increase the resourcing around the enforcement? Because what I don't want to see happen is a false expectation for people around enforcement if we're currently only bringing one prosecution a year. So is there any proposal to increase that resourcing?
So if there was a look at resourcing, it wouldn't be done through this process. It would be done through the management of the unit. But all of the dog registration fees so people are required under the Act to register their dog. We charge a fee which is set through the annual plan process. And then all of those dog registration fees fund the activities of the animal management unit.
And is there any increase in the 10-year plan around the enforcement for this bylaw?
Sorry, I misunderstood the question.
Is there any increase over the next 10 years for enforcement of this bylaw?
In respect of resources?
Yeah.
Not at this stage. I don't get, animal management doesn't get any rates funding, and we only get a bucket of money that we've got to spread across.
Thank you for that.
Kelly?
Thanks, team. Just really interested in the professional dog walking fraternity. Have you got any guidance around the numbers of dogs under control by professional dog walkers?
So that's one of the issues, that it's not a regulated industry. So you can't you can advertise your services as a dog walker, but anybody can set up that type of business. There's no qualification or requirement or accreditation or anything like that. So we don't know exactly what we're dealing with, but we have noticed an increase in people taking a larger number of dogs into public places. So we get reports of that, and our rangers see it, and our dog control officers see it. So that is a trend that's happening, and it seems to be a sort of post-COVID trend as well.
So if it's determined that 2 or 3 dogs is the maximum number that you might be able to walk, obviously there's popular support for that. I guess professional dog walkers would have to follow those bylaws. Is that right?
Yeah, the bylaw applies to everybody because it's about the control of dogs in public places. We'll be bringing those proposals to you in October. So we're still working through all the issues and understanding what might be helpful in terms of regulating in that area.
So you're saying that there might be a solution for professional dog walkers. Is that right? Yes, my other question is around enforcement in terms of people not picking up their dog droppings. Yeah. How many fines have you handed out over the last year, say? Do you have any data on that?
Yeah, so it's specifically for breaches of the bylaw in general. We issued 52 infringements over the last year, and a substantial amount of warnings.
Yeah.
The actual offence is failing to remove it, the fouling. The biggest issue we have is we need to have sufficient evidence to take to court, because everyone can defend their infringement in court.
Sure.
And in a lot of occasions we don't have that, then we'll issue a warning because we just don't have the evidence to support the allegation.
What is the evidence?
Right, so that's interesting. So what we would generally require is, and we get a lot of it, is security footage of the dog fouling, and then the dog owner not picking it up, walking away.
Yeah.
Is what we normally, a lot of people take photos on their mobile phones and send it through to us. In those cases, it's quite clear the evidence is overwhelming, then we will issue infringements.
So we don't have our own cameras or anything like that on spots. We rely on the public.
District wide, thinking about all those areas people can see dogs. No, we don't.
Okay.
We're running out of time. Thank you.
Well, hang on. I've got one really important
You
question
would.
because I'm a
What-
member of
leave the
the
last-
Estuary
this one for
Trust.
last.
And
Right.
the Estuary Trust, very interested in protecting the estuary. How many enforcement notices have you enforced for dogs out of control on the estuary on our wetland of international significance? Any idea?
I can provide that. I'm just going to have to take me a while, but I'll get all that data available.
Yeah, that'd be really good to know. I mean, yeah, there's not many places in the world that have wetlands of international significance, but we've got one, and we need to protect those birds. Thank you. Tim.
A good sales pitch there, mate. Yeah. Just with regards to the estuary, that the difference between attack and nuisance is a huge difference, isn't it? And so the effect on wildlife with a nuisance is probably obviously a lot greater effect on the wildlife than a single attack. So I'm just wondering, is there any way we can get statistics, or you can get statistics from any sort of estuary trust or whatever?
We have been in touch with the Estuary Trust, and they've certainly been in touch with us about information that they hold. They've done surveys looking at whether people are complying with the rules or not. There's a lot of non-compliance, but we do get into a dangerous area in a way where we're only looking at stats because it's again, if a dog has attacked a bird, unless someone tells us, or we find a bird that's clearly been attacked by dogs, we won't know. So that doesn't mean it's not happening.
Yes, absolutely.
But also with ground nesting birds, so the wading birds in particular only have a small window where they can feed on the estuary area because of the tide coming and going. Also because of migration, they are often very hungry and need to feed a lot, either to build up for going or to replenish when they arrive. And their nesting areas are in the shoreline, and they're often camouflaged, so people might be walking along blindly and not realizing that they're disturbing the birds. The birds can be disturbed by a dog barking nearby, and they can flee the nest, and then it can be too much of a time period before they come back and settle, and those eggs might not be viable, and that's that whole breeding season gone for those birds.
Thank you.
It's really important.
Thank you. Right, we're out of time, but we've got 3 questions. So as long as 3 quick questions and 3 reasonably quick answers. So we'll start Tyrone first.
I'll curtail mine. So is there, in the Littleton context, right, there's the Littleton rec ground where you've got to have a dog on a leash. Used to be under effective control, but dogs pooped everywhere, and that wasn't very good if you're playing sport in the winter. But there's no sport going on there in the summer, not organised sport. Is there a possibility of like having different time bound or seasonal bound rules?
There is. We tend to avoid it because it just makes it that much more complex in terms of understanding and enforcement. But we are looking at what we can do with Littleton Rec Ground because we know it's a concern of the community. We know people want to use the space to exercise their dogs because it's one of a few flat bits of land, but we also know the community's been really frustrated with the amount of people not picking up after their dogs. We're trying to work out what balance to get there.
That is an excellent answer and means I don't need to ask another question. Thank you.
I love it because it was as long as the first one. Tyler, please. Press your mute button, buddy.
Testing.
Mm-hmm.
Good.
Yep.
Sweet. Kia ora, guys. Thanks so much. This is actually about a policy thing, not necessarily around the city. And when I was in a hearing last time, I saw that there was 2 tiers, which was either menacing or dangerous. But we were unable to utilize tools to apply more restrictions, and we didn't want to make them a dangerous dog. Is this the platform we were able to make changes to be able to apply a more agile framework to the restorative or punitive measures and hearings panels?
So I'm not sure if what you're talking about is what's specified in the Dog Control Act itself, in which case we can't change it, or whether it's something that comes out of our dog control policy. So it might be helpful to have a more detailed discussion about the concern you're trying to address for us to work out whether it's something that we can change.
Add things within the policy or bylaw to add further restrictions that the Act doesn't allow us to do?
It's possible that we have some discretion, but again, we'd need to know the specifics of the issues that you're talking about.
Okay, no worries. No, that's the only question. Thank you.
Thank you, mate. And lastly, Sarah, please.
No, I just want to point out to Councillor Scandrett and others who've asked, I've just sent through the Estuary Trust, the research and bits and pieces that was done on the dog disturbance and those kind of things.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation and very good answers. Thank you very much. Okie doke. So now we'll hear from Christchurch NZ and staff who are here to give us an update on the creative sector.
Hi, so just whilst Kiri's getting the right slides, because we've got two lots of slides. Hello, feels like a while since I've seen you all. If you cast your mind back about 18 months, we were asked in our letter of expectation to undertake some work to consider support that could be provided to the local music sector. So we at Christchurch NZ actually took a step back and said, let's broaden that and do an economic analysis of the broader creative sector to identify areas where we've got relative strengths as a city, weaknesses and some of the trends, so that as an intervention agency, we can work out where our time and resources best spent to address market failure or opportunities. So that's what we're going to take you through today. Now, obviously, as the Economic Development Agency, our lens is to think about the commercial creative arts activity in terms of the economic benefit that brings to the city. But as we all know, there's significant value in the arts from a more broad community perspective. It brings a real richness to the city. It might not be commercialised, but that really helps to support Christchurch's attractiveness. So that's why we're going to come and present today in a joined up approach with Kiri and her team, because they have the more sort of community angle. And we're really looking forward to hopefully a good discussion around a really holistic view of the creative arts sector in Christchurch. Hopefully you all know Nick, who has been here a few times. This is Sophie Jones, who is our economic analyst, and she's going to be taking you through it. I'm going to sit back and let these guys do all the hard work and answer the difficult questions.
Kia ora koutou, everyone. Yeah, thanks for having us here today. So, as Ali said, as the Economic Development Agency, we did some work last year, which you requested that we went away and looked at the local music sector. We took a broader approach to that and did a full review of the creative arts industries, I suppose, for want of a better word. So we're going to provide an overview of what the economic contribution is. So we're going to be really thinking about the commercialised end of arts. And as Ali said, we'll hand over to Kerry, who can provide a little bit more of that richness around the community sector. And then we'll take questions after that, probably, so that you can ask questions of both of us. So before we drill into the direct contribution to the economy, which was where the focus of the work was that Sophie did, we thought it's just worth reflecting a little bit on the broader value of having a strong creative arts economy and having people with creative talents in our economy. The creative skills that are prevalent in the sector that we're going to drill into today are also utilised across almost every other sector within our industry. So there's a lot of transfer of skills. If you think about design of products, promotion, advertising, marketing, they're all using very similar skills to those that are in the more pure creative sector. So there are skills across various sectors that we're not going to drill into today, but that transfer of talent is really important. Having a creative community really supports innovation and entrepreneurship. There's plenty of evidence of that from studies in other places, nothing specific here, but the innovation that comes out of having creative people who think outside the box and are willing to test and experiment, and they also tend to have a higher rate of entrepreneurship. And we use art to have a sense of who we are, to tell a story of who we are as a city, and that plays a key role in the city's attractiveness. I'm not sure if you can see, that's a little bit small, but in terms of drilling into the economic contribution and thinking about the direct contribution across the sector, we have split the creative arts into 7 separate subsectors. This followed a methodology that had already been applied in Auckland and Wellington, so we were able to compare and contrast the different pieces of work that were done, and also meant that we could just borrow from them a methodology. It's worth noting there, we've got those 7 subsectors: design, screen, music and radio, literature, print and publishing, craft and visual arts, digital media and performing arts. We were asked specifically to look at local music. In the methodology, we have had to be a bit creative in terms of trying to estimate the size of that from an economic perspective. A lot of the local music activity happens in, or gets captured within the hospitality sector. When you actually start drilling into the stats and looking at where the employment and the GDP is created. So there's a little bit of creative accounting in that one to try and account for that. So the estimates around that particular sector are probably less reliable than the others. But that said, there's actually a bit of a weakness in the data across this sector as a whole. A lot of the work that happens in this sector is often part-time with a day job or freelance work, and so some of the data that we rely on to get information about the size of the economy is probably undercooking. So what we present to you today is probably an underestimate. Just looking at the national economy, first of all, and comparing Canterbury region with the other two big metro regions, Auckland, Wellington, and New Zealand as a whole. GDP in the contribution of the creative arts sector to GDP in New Zealand is around 2.8% of national GDP and employs around 69,000 people. There is a significant concentration of creative arts activity in Auckland. They have around about 30-something% of the population, I think, but 52% of the creative arts sector output. So a real concentration of this activity in our largest city. In Canterbury, we produce about 10% of national GDP for creative arts, compared with about 11% overall of GDP across the whole economy. But there are some subsectors where we over-index, and those are design quite heavily, digital media, and we have a marginally higher share of the performing arts compared to the picture. Drilling into Christchurch. Just at a top level, it employs over 5,500 people, probably closer to 6,000 given the undercounting, and creates around $720 million of GDP. And looking at how that breaks down across the workforce, 8.2% of the national creative sector workforce is in the city. That compares to 8.9% of the total workforce. So we have 8.9% of the national workforce here, but only 8.2% of the national creative sector. So that talks a little bit to that under-indexing as well. Design sector really dominates, with just over half of employment in that part of the community. The workforce in Christchurch is growing much faster in this sector than in others, with 7.5% growth between 2017 and 2022. So this is an area of growth for the city. To put the total workforce in context, it's around about the same size as the local and central government workforce in the city. So if you think about the people working in government, we've got a similar number of people working in the creative sectors. Looking at GDP, it's obviously a similar pattern. The number of people working in an area obviously has a direct correlation to the amount of output. But the sector contributes around 2.4% of the city's GDP. We produce around 7.3% of national output within Christchurch. And again, obviously the design sector dominating even more strong in this chart because the productivity within that subsector is slightly higher than some of the others. In terms of growth across the whole of the creative sector, it's been a really high growth area. In the last 5 years of that chart, between 2017 and 2022, I'm sorry you can't see the numbers at the bottom, the creative sector has grown at double the rate of the economy in general, almost, not quite, but almost double. And that's been following a similar trajectory to growth nationally, but actually slightly slower. And that slightly slower growth here is mainly due to a significant decline in publishing and literature, which you can see on this chart, which breaks down that growth across the subsectors. So this is a 5-year growth between 2017 and 2022. Very strong growth in digital media, up 119%. Very strong growth in screen, up 49%, and building on that already strong base, design growing at 37%. The lack of growth or the very flat performance in the performing arts is largely due and reflecting disruptions from COVID. Obviously, if you can't gather, that's an area that gets significantly impacted. So we would expect that if we were to get more recent data to not look quite so bleak and to be on a bit of a growth trajectory and hopefully going even faster once we get new venues opening up in the near future. That literature and print publishing dropping at 20%, that reflects a broader role in the economy, broader shift in the economy from print to digital. So that's a bit of that growth in digital is about shifting in the way that people consume media. But that shift has hit Christchurch particularly hard because we had a particular strength in literature and print publishing 10, 20 years ago. So over the last 2 decades, the amount of employment and output within that sector has fallen significantly. So just coming back and the top line findings from the work that we did. In Christchurch, the sector employs over 5,700 people, creates at least $718 million in GDP. Design and digital media are real areas of economic advantage. The creative arts are growing at nearly twice the pace of the broader economy. And the strongest economic development growth opportunities are in screen and digital media, which are increasingly converging as well. A lot of the skills and technology applies across those two sectors, and increasingly the same firms are doing the same work. So that's where we've got had and still have our focus as the Economic Development Agency through the Screen Office, and the Screen Office is shifting to reflect that convergence as well between not just screen but also digital media, and hopefully we're able to keep that high growth trajectory going, particularly with the extension of the Screen Grant through the LTP decisions recently. So that's an overview of the economy from the creative arts sector. So I'll hand over to Kiri. Is it best to hand over to Kiri and then ask questions at the end? Thanks.
Ko Kiri Jardinaho, I'm Principal Arts Advisor here at Council, and I'll just quickly introduce the team. We've got Zara Potts, who's been contracting with us for some time now and looks after our website, newsletter and social media on behalf of Toi o Tautahi. We've got Olivia Webb and Jamie Hanton, who are Community Arts Advisors. So I think we'll jump into the next slide if we can. So just briefly reintroducing the arts strategy, Toi o Tautahi. There are sort of 5 areas of focus for us. Create an encounter, so supporting opportunities for artists to create and for others to experience the arts within the city and region. Ngā Toi Māori, so Māori art across the city created by local Māori artists, and we work with Ngāi Tahu artists also from wherever they're coming from. Inclusion, so we're increasing opportunities for communities and artists to initiate and participate in arts opportunities. Connection, so this is sits largely in the work of that Zara undertakes on our behalf, so ensuring that the opportunities are well promoted out there in the community. Resource, so that's about us and the strategy partners. So when the art strategy was endorsed by Council and created, we were working with Creative New Zealand, Rata Foundation, Mana Whenua, and then more lately Manatū Taonga, Ministry for Culture and Heritage as well. Later in this year, we'll be back to talk to elected members about a check-in of the strategy. It'll be we're just about at year 5 for the strategy. We'll be testing those priorities and some of the activities we've been undertaking over the last 5 years to see if they're still holding true. And we've just initiated this year a review of the art and public places policy also. So we'll be back to talk about those things. I'll hand over to Olivia.
Tēnā koutou, thank you for your time today. I'm pleased to provide you with a brief overview of participation in the arts in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and how Christchurch compares to national data. quick definition of participation. So participation data is separate from audience and attendance data. By participation, we mean active involvement in the making or presentation of art in the last 12 months. So that might be attending classes, groups, workshops, or creating art and culture through dance, performance, music, film, writing, etc. And just as an aside, we note that Canterbury levels of audience attendance are in line with the national average, that 72% of residents have attended at least one arts event or in the last 12 months. But today we focus on participation for a good reason. There are multiple international studies that demonstrate that community cultural engagement is good for everyone's well-being, no matter where they live. So it's important that people have opportunities to participate in the arts and creativity. One recent study from the UK found that people who engaged with creating arts and crafting had greater ratings for happiness, life satisfaction, and feeling that life was worthwhile than for those who did not, even after taking into account other factors such as age, gender, health, and employment. At a national and local level, Creative New Zealand and Colmar Brunton has conducted the New Zealanders in the Arts longitudinal study to measure engagement with the arts. These surveys are repeated every 3 years since 2005 and have provided a really vital insight to trends over time. They survey individual residents. The 2023 survey, the most recent one, showed that over 60% of New Zealanders agree that the arts help to improve New Zealand society, help define who we are as New Zealanders, help to contribute positively to our economy, and should receive public funding. Furthermore, the survey found that 99% of young people participate in the arts, with a huge interest in digital media and visual arts, and in Ngā Toi Māori. And 79% of parents believe taking part in the arts makes their child more well-rounded. Locally, this survey shows that 55% of Canterbury residents, it's 360,000 people, have participated in at least one art form in the last 12 months, and that's in line with the national average. That 21% of Canterbury residents, 140,000 people, have participated in the arts on a more regular basis in the last 12 months. And again, that's on par with the national average. In addition to the national survey of New Zealanders, our team has led a local survey of arts organisations over the past 2 years, gathering data about membership and participation. There are over 350 arts organisations in Ōtautahi, ranging from small local community groups to our large organisations who you'll know well, such as the CSO, the Court Theatre, who serve the whole city. That survey found that on average, 90,000 people actively participate in arts organisations and groups in Ōtautahi each year. So these two surveys show a high rate of participation in arts and culture and creativity in our city. These surveys report that Canterbury residents are strong advocates for the arts, and they believe the arts play a key role in creating a better society. There's also a perceived value at a community and personal level that the arts help us to express our diversity, create connection and communities, support individuals' psychological well-being, and expand our perspectives. I'm going to hand over to Zara. Yeah.
Oh, this is actually going to be me.
Oh, this is you.
Just a wee bit about our arts events. Obviously council produces a range of arts events each year: Sparks, Tirama Mai, Go Live Festival, Winter Fireworks, Kite Day, New Year's Eve, Summer Theatre, and Summer Sundays. These attract a combined audience of over 220,000 people annually from across Christchurch, Canterbury, and increasingly further afield. Of course, Electric Avenue is the largest one-day festival in Aotearoa and aiming to be bigger in 2025 with the 2-day format. And that event brings in excess of $6 million into the local economy. And then we can look back on the work of Scape and street artists and street art festivals, along with the post-quake commissioning of public arts which we believe makes us a public arts destination. And the city is home to a highly regarded word festival, among other creative pursuits through the community.
Okay, kia ora. I'm not sure whether you've looked at it yet or not, but the Toi Otatahi website is going great guns. Since launch, we have grown the audience online to more than, I think the latest number is about 55,000 unique users. And so what that means is that basically we're getting about 10,000 new users. So there are people that haven't come to the site before online each month checking out what we've got in Christchurch. So it's a fantastic opportunity for our local arts organisations to promote their performances, their people, their events free of charge to quite a wide audience. So we're really happy with that. We've had a huge amount of interest, particularly around events around Matarihi. So that's another really good opportunity for us as a city to build on that. So we had, I think, huge numbers that were coming through on the site around June, July. Our user sessions are really good as well. We're getting something like 43 sessions a day, which might not sound like a lot, but for a kind of a website like this, it's actually pretty good. A random view of our users in August showed about 3 users every minute. So they're coming and they're sticking on the site. So they obviously, with websites, it's a bit people don't spend a lot of time reading, but we have an average of about a minute 20 on the site, which is not too bad. And they're clicking through. So they're not just coming to the homepage, they're going to look at events, they're going to look at profiles, they're going to look at lots of different stuff on the site. We have published so far an average of about 700 or about around 700 articles, which works out at about just over nearly 4.5 stories a week, which our problem is not so much getting the stories, but having the space to actually, there are so many stories that we could do every week. It's just getting the time to actually publish them. There's so much happening in the city. Social media is pretty good. We tend to kind of complement what we put on the site with our social media channels. So they are mostly Instagram we focus on. That seems to be where we get the most traffic. Facebook as well. We haven't quite got into TikTok yet, but that's something that we probably should look at. We tend to skew relatively older on both of those channels, although Instagram we are getting kind of a more youthful audience in terms of 25 to 34-year-olds. That's about a quarter of our overall audience, but the numbers keep growing on those channels, so we're pretty happy with that. And the other thing that we are concentrating on is our newsletter, and that goes out once a month to subscribers. We're averaging about 5 new subscribers a week, which is pretty good. And basically we have a really good open rate, which means often people they subscribe to a newsletter and they don't open it. We have an average of 60% open rate, which is actually really high, and means our audience is really engaged, which is fantastic. Again, we're beginning to get a younger demographic with our newsletter. And in terms of our content, I mean, we're really just focusing very much on Christchurch people, Christchurch artists, right through the disciplines. We have everything covered, but it really is kind of a great opportunity for different organisations and different individuals to promote their work with us and get it out to a wide audience. We've also had quite a lot of interest from overseas, so there's quite a big international factor that's coming, including approaches from Melbourne, wanting to kind of set up different things that we can do around expats, around people who are in Melbourne who are from Christchurch. So there's quite a lot of opportunity for us to really claim this space with this site and all of the associated channels with it. So that's kind of it.
That's a great seg into what I'm going to be talking about, the opportunity in the city, just building on all of the data that we've heard today from Christchurch NZ and from our team. We've presented in the city with an amazing opportunity now to capitalise on an amazing reputation and history of arts, culture, creativity. And we should understand and acknowledge that in Te Ao Māori, arts and creativity are ingrained in everyday life. And we're privileged to live in a city where bicultural identity is so visibly and seamlessly embedded into the streets and buildings. You can see it on the Ngā Whāriki Manaki along the river. You can see it in the amazing Wahara outside Te Pai. You can see it on the Justice Precinct. It's everywhere. And when people visit Christchurch, those are the things they notice. It is a unique city, and we're ahead of the game in Aotearoa, New Zealand with that. In the 20th century, radicals, innovators, pictured here is the group. So writers, poets who defined the colonial experience of living in New Zealand and Christchurch. In the 80s, we have the Dunedin sound, but we do really know that is the Christchurch sound. We spawned that, and we should really own that. Into the 90s, we had Pacific Underground, who again defined the zeitgeist of a city and a country, a multicultural city and a country moving into the new millennium. Post-quake, again, we became internationally recognized for our creative response to a tragic event. And while the immediate rebuild period has ended, there is still urgency, and there is the possibility to capitalize on this reputation by telling a story that spans the entirety of our history and our heritage. In a world where content and stories are everywhere, powerful narratives are really valuable, and we have that in spades. So where we are now, like I said, moving away from the transitional phase in the city, we're about to enter a new era where the infrastructure coming online in the city is going to be, without a doubt, the best in the country. Pictured here, One New Zealand Stadium, we'll see some of the world's biggest musical acts coming, but the stadium's modular design has also meant that it can be fitted out for smaller concerts. It can be supporting emerging and local artists as well. In Parakiori, the multi-sports centre, 3 custom-built, designed dance and movement studios. So again, this is incredibly innovative and builds on Christchurch's history as a circus home. So we had pre-quake at CPIT, the only tertiary course in New Zealand that was delivering circus. And so we are well set to continue delivering on that, especially with the relaunch of the World Buskers Festival in 2025. In 2028, we have Canterbury Museum reopening, and like our public built environments, this museum will showcase and represent our bicultural identity in a way that won't be seen in the country. And next year, the Court Theatre opens. So this is already the country's only full production house theatre. So everything that's made, the sets, all goes on behind the house, will be moving back into the central city. Designed by internationally renowned theatre architects Harworth and Thompson and iconic New Zealand architects Athfield, the space will provide opportunities for professional theatre, but also their smaller kind of forge off-centre stage will provide opportunities for community development and presentation. Again, just building on some of the notes and research that Christchurch NZ have delivered and Creative New Zealand, the numbers are really showing that our audience is shifting towards a younger and more diverse population. And those communities are the most hungry for arts, culture, and creativity activities. Just flip quickly to this slide. This is a slide from the research that Olivia talked about, the higher importance, lower importance in the Creative New Zealand survey audience atlas, looking at people's attitudes towards arts, culture, creativity. So you can see those who say higher importance are overrepresented in Auckland and Wellington, but younger, skewing female, Pacific peoples. And in the lower importance, you can see are older, skewing male, and Pākehā and European in that. So we are moving into a more diverse population where we'll be moving towards the higher end of things. So we are in a real purple patch, and we're very lucky to be where we are. So in terms of that, and Christchurch New Zealand's newly launched city brand as a place for play, we can position ourselves as a city of creativity, innovation, and fun with a seriously impressive heritage to back it up.
So to wrap up our part and to bring back in our colleagues from Christchurch NZ, we obviously want to keep building on the city profile as a place to be creative. That is the lead vision for our arts strategy. And we do see evidence of more young creative people moving to the city. Obviously the Christchurch has a reputation for being slightly more affordable, but I think it's also got a growing reputation as being creatively quite interesting and supportive. So we want to maintain that effort. We do have a question for you, whether that gets answered here today or whether you take that away and come back to us, is what's your view or vision of a cultural powerhouse? What does that mean to councillors? Because we've got some ideas, but we'd be keen to understand more about your vision and view. So kia ora koutou, thank you.
All good. Tim, then Yanni.
Yeah, it's nice to see I'm of low importance, being a skewed old male and some Pākehā Europeans, but I've known that. My wife and kids have told me that for a long time. Your question, what I would say is a mature cultural organisation community, because we've got to build on the philanthropic. We have a lot of burdens on the council, which are valuable to all communities right across the board. So we've got to weigh that up, as you well know. My question to you is, what's your relationship with the Chamber of Commerce and those dions of our business as everything's exploding? And your slide number 7 shows, how many lawyers do you need in a film set? How many, or a gig, how many accountants do you need? So you need a lot more people than just those. So I can totally get the figures, but how are you hooking into and maturing, and maturing 2 ways? One is maturing our philanthropic community and those business dions that this is really important to, and it's a 2-way split, isn't it?
Yeah.
How we all bring ourselves along the journey, and I'm just wondering how you do that.
We do have a story to tell and to bring along with us, and I guess from a council perspective anyway, that's probably been project by project. So with the likes of Te Rama Mai, for instance, our main sponsors Orion and Kinetics, but then also working with Riverside, with Trees for Canterbury actually, and I guess working to engage more with hospitality and businesses in the area that the event is operating. And I think as the reputation and the audience certainly has built, we had around 120,000 people through Te Rama Mai this year, for instance. It's businesses, I think, seeing the opportunity as well to leverage the activity that's happening around them.
It's a journey, and it's great to see where it is, but we've got to keep it going. So that formal communication or connection with Chamber of Commerce, would be interesting.
Yanni, please.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation and the work that you've done. I guess, given what we've kind of been told, I'm interested in whether you've had a chance to reflect on whether our economic ambition needs to be adjusted to support creative cultural industries. Because I've just looked at the 10-year priorities and there's no mention of it. Then I hear the wonderful work that's happening in that space and think, is that a gap? And is that something we need to be more deliberate in terms of our support?
I think it's a really interesting question. I think what we're keen to do is come and talk to you in a few months about a review of those 3 strategies. So the DMP, the city narrative or brand, and the economic ambition, because what we're finding is the more we engage the private sector, and the private sector really are engaged. And just to your point, Tim, just wanted to add that more and more, I think the private sector are starting to understand that the purview of economic development is not just local and central government, and that actually if they can help contribute to make the pie bigger, then everybody wins. So, and I think that's got to be a long-term solution for this. So as I'm discussing the economic ambition with private sector, I think we're starting to refine some of the particularly the implementation parts of it. So the vision remains the same. The tactics that we're using to help organisations become more regenerative remain the same. The bit in the middle, these transition challenges that we're looking at, is the bit that's changing, and that's around those 10 years priorities. So there's absolutely room to have a look at it, Yanni, in short. So
okay, and then I guess the second question from me is, as someone who chairs our Strengthening Communities funding, recognising that we seem to be in this place where groups are asking for more and more and finding it harder and harder. At the same time, we're getting a number of new spaces, bigger spaces, an oversupply almost of space that all seems to have a business case that says they'll just get people coming and using it for functions and that'll pay the way. But we're not seeing it. What we're seeing is an increased demand on our funding to support. So I'm really interested if there was any assessment of the sustainability of the spaces and the venues that we've got or that we're going to have, and what that looks like going forward in terms of how we can create that security of operations and funding. And I guess that's kind of triggered by the conversation around New Zealand Opera. When I look at who's actually benefiting in terms of the schools, it's generally outside of our city, or it's the private wealthy schools within our city. It's not actually the people that are on that high importance list in terms of arts that I would think would be a natural target. And I'm just kind of wondering if there's any big picture thinking about the future in terms of how we fund, what we fund, and I guess the organisational delivery.
We're always thinking about it because it is a challenge, and has been a challenge for the city, and will likely always be. I'm not sure that there's ever going to be enough resource to meet everyone's desires and dreams and the things that people value in the community. So that, I mean, that's not a great answer, but we're aware of the issue, and I guess as a small team, we do our best to work with organisations, both to provide them feedback from council and our own or councillors. So you had many parts to your question there.
Thank you. We are running out of time. I've just got two questions. I went to, lucky enough to go to China a couple of weeks ago with Victoria and Jake. Please tell me, Jake, what town that city was in with all that light show.
They pretty much all had one, but specifically Wuhan.
Yeah. They have it every night, right? And they're lucky they've got a big river in the middle of town. They go back and forth. The one that was on, say, the Harley building, for argument's sake, how expensive is that? Could we do that on a number of buildings around town every night? Or is that a problem?
We've actually pulled together a city illumination strategy that through our urban development team that actually looks at, because illumination is super interesting because it not only creates an attraction, but it helps with safety. So it becomes a sort of a real two for one deal. I think we've got a proposal to come and talk to you, I think in October around that. So I think you'll hear a little bit more about illumination because I think it's an absolute opportunity for the city.
Oh, absolutely, I couldn't agree with you more. You know, we haven't got the scale of what they had over there, but what we saw was outstanding. And the other thing is, in the LTP, we gave Kelly, I need help here, $300,000 to a group to paint buildings, murals. Yeah, is that part of what you facilitate as well? So you're hand in glove with them.
Yep.
Okay.
So that's the skate work that Mike Pekaski's doing. So we help them get to the point where you were comfortable giving them money. Absolutely.
Good as gold. Pauline, and then Aaron, and then we're done.
Actually, mine was similar. I was just assuming that in the category craft and visual arts is all your street art.
Yeah.
Right. And noting that we're growing at 14% as opposed to New Zealand at 10%. So obviously that's going really well for Christchurch. I see that we're on a roll, says Phil. So cultural powerhouse, would that be like if we were New Zealand's #1 destination for art and culture?
I think so.
People tend to think that city beginning with W, but I'm thinking that we could actually be there, and we quite possibly are.
Yeah.
So would that be an appropriate definition?
Yeah, I think we can be very proud of where the city has come to and the way that we nurture and support artists and creativity in the city.
Yeah, and I think the way that the people of Christchurch are coming out and supporting it is, I mean, look at Fire on High last weekend. That was even more successful than the year before. Yeah. So people are actually coming out and supporting the events and stuff too. So that's a key indicator. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great.
Pauline. So we are running out of time. We've got Aaron and Celeste, and that's it.
Yeah, just a question around financial viability of artists. A lot of them have their hand out. How do we move away from that and get more of them, or teach them, or whatever, to actually make money and make a living out of being an artist? There's not much talk about that. You can do courses in every form of art except the management side. No one seems to concentrate on that. And what's the way forward there? Because
We do offer a program of workshops and masterclasses, as well as an incubator program. And most of those take place at Toyoa, our arts hub. So they will cover taxation, marketing, and some of the accounting that's necessary, because most individual artists are set up as sole traders or businesses, or are working their way to get there. I think if you have the opportunity to check out the Creative New Zealand study, you'll see that a great number of artists will also have paying day jobs, because the arts career won't be sustaining a full-time life.
Yeah, and that's kind of when you look at the funding, and in New Zealand On Air and the Film Commission have been great for it, is backing projects that no one overseas ever wants to watch. And if we change that attitude, because every story made by a New Zealander is a New Zealand story, but just start making something for a bigger audience, because then you can stand on your own 2 feet. But that's never been a directive of them. How do we influence that commercial viability becomes part of what you're trying to do?
Some artists will gravitate,
because then even more will get jobs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So some will gravitate towards that practice, or they'll make that commercial element much more of their life, their way of making an income. They might manage both the stuff they want to do for themselves, the passion projects.
Yeah, that's a hobby.
It can earn money, and the stuff that might earn them more money to sustain a life.
Yeah, because we've tuned out a lot of really good commercial artists, just most of them have left. I've got a really long list on my phone, so text Sinead one day of all the music ones. But
and lastly, Celeste, thank you very much.
Thank you. It was really interesting, and from my perspective, I think it's appropriate that we kind of position ourselves as the leaders, because I think we already are. So looking forward to seeing how we can support that, given that there is a massive, if you're focused on this, of course, economic benefit to the city, but there's obviously a number of other benefits. I just had a look at the website. I didn't know that was there. I think it's great. I also quite interested to know, like, in terms of your perspective, how because I like the fact that you've got neighbourhoods, and I think that's a really great approach in terms of the West and the South, and because you do have sort of communities that congregate in different attractions. Do you see something that you'll kind of keep developing? Because I noticed there's only a couple of dots on the map, but I know of other things in the area.
Yeah, the neighbourhoods are a really good idea. We're just in the process of refining the website. So basically what will happen with those, we'll keep those in all of the disciplines, all of the venues. There's also like an interactive map at the bottom that you'll see that kind of goes into the neighbourhoods. But that's very much a focus of us going forward in terms of really defining some of those neighbourhoods and the things and the people and the industries that are coming out of there. Because I think for us also with Toi Otatahi is not just, kind of to your point, Erin, is not just focusing on like artists, but also all of the other, there are so many people involved in arts who are not necessarily practicing artists. And that's creative as well, from lawyers to chefs to all sorts of things. And so we really want to kind of extend that definition of creative and put that onto the, you'll see in the website, there'll be like furniture designers, that come out of different places. So yeah, the neighbourhoods are something that we're really wanting to focus on.
And just one final comment on that, is I think that works really well, because if you look at neat places and other things that target a specific demographic, they do have that real local lens, which I think works well. And I think the other appealing thing about that is, neighbourhoods become destinations. So you have places like Oamaru, which have really leveled up in certain sectors. So people travel there for those particular environments, and each part of the city has its own thing. I mean, obviously I'm a bit biased, but the Eastern Suburbs has quite a specific kind of sort of an area where it is a bit of a hub for things that develop, such as Watch the Space, which we funded in terms of street art, and that kind of now has sort of also got those links across the city. So I think it's really exciting.
And if you look at somewhere like Littleton, which is really a home base for music, and it always has been in art as well. If you look at the artists who have come out of there, there's just, there is just so much opportunity in all areas of the city, including just outside the city as well, Rangiora, Akaroa, the peninsula. So there's a lot of scope for us to do lots.
Brilliant. And I know you're desperate for time, but I'm just going to leave you with copies of these. So it's just an FYI, you'll be aware that the World Buskers Festival which is obviously part of the work we do in the creative sector. We've got a new delivery partner, Hoo Ha Productions. We've also got a new creative. We're going back away from bread and circus back to the name World Biscuits Festival. That was a big piece of work that looked at that. So there'll be a soft launch of this. I'll just leave these with you for you to have a look at.
Thank you. And thank you very much for your presentation. Much appreciated. Thank you. Okey doke. Conservation work on bird populations in Christchurch and Banks Peninsula. Andrew and Paul. This presentation's been requested by
Melanie and Celeste.
Mel and Celeste. How you doing, Paul? Good?
Good, Phil. How are you?
Excellent. The floor is yours, gentlemen.
Thank you. Do you want to start off, Paul, or just get into it?
Yeah, crack into it.
Hi, everybody. I'm Andrew Crossland. Some of you may or may not know me. I work in the Parks Biodiversity team here in Civic, but I used to work with Paul for about 20 years as a park ranger. And this is my 39th year and 11th month monitoring the birds of Christchurch. So this is a wee bit of a short summary of what we have here. So I just set this machine will work. It does. Great. So although it's sort of counterintuitive, because when you fly over the city, all you see is trees and wheat fields and sheep paddocks, we actually have the highest avian biodiversity of any part of New Zealand. There's no other part that has more bird species recorded than we do here in Christchurch and Central Canterbury. And by Central Canterbury, I mean the sort of Selwyn, Waimakariri, and Christchurch City, Banks Peninsula areas. There's 263 bird species been recorded here since the 1850s when Europeans arrived. And more than 250 of those have been recorded within our Christchurch district. It's super high. We have a lot of threatened species and at-risk species. There's a list up there on the screen showing the numbers of the various types of categories we have. And so we have a real obligation to protect these species long term. So most bird species of conservation importance in our area are not forest birds. A lot of the thinking around bringing back birds to the city or conservation revolves around planting trees, about building habitats, with the assumption that if you've got the trees, the birds will come. But the fact is that the vast majority of the bird life here is not forest birds, and the species for which this place is of national and international importance for bird life are almost entirely wetland birds and seabirds. So the reason for that is because Christchurch, both north and south, so on the northern side, we have the Avon Heathcote Estuary and Brooklands Lagoon, the Pegasus Bay Lowlands, Travis Wetland, the Waimakariri River, and to the south, we have Lake Ellesmere, Te Waiwhora, Lake Forsyth, etc. So we are a central migration node for birds that are breeding in the southern South Island, moving north. So if you look at the map of the South Island, you'll see Banks Peninsula is about halfway down on the right-hand side. Birds, most of New Zealand's water birds breed in the riverbeds and in the mountains of the East and South Island. They move down the rivers about Christmas time when they finish breeding, and they move up along the coast and they hit Banks Peninsula. Very few species fly around Banks Peninsula. They fly overland, over Tautapu, over Horswell, over Christchurch, and they stop either at Lake Ellesmere or on the wetlands in Pegasus Bay here. There, they molt, they lose feathers and change plumages. They put on weight and condition after breeding. They form large post-breeding flocks, and they continue. Many of them continue migrating north. They either go to the far north of the North Island, places like Manukau Harbour, Kaipara, the Firth of Thames, or to the northern part of the South Island, Beale Spit, right round to Nelson. And almost all of those birds are moving through our city. So at peak times, which is in the late summer, we have more than 100,000 wetland birds in the Greater Christchurch area, which is of international significance. On the entire East Asian, Australasian flyway, which spans from Siberia right down to Stewart Island, This is one of the key areas. Only 2 parts of the country have these numbers. That's us and the Auckland harbours. Super important. We have a lot of species that are really notable here. The crested grebe, the bird that won the Bird of the Year award last year with an American fella, or the English guy in America. Quarter of the New Zealand population are found in our district. That species used to have a total population of about 200 birds. And then in 1987, 3 turned up at Lake Forsyth, the first time in 100 years one had been seen outside of the mountains. When the first settlers arrived, they were all through the swamps of Christchurch, but they retreated to high country lakes. Those 3 birds came back the next year with 10, then it was 20, and eventually it was 300, more than the entire population. And what had happened was they discovered that rather than trying to survive in lakes that freeze over in winter in the high country, if they migrated down to the coastal lakes, mainly Lake Forsyth, where there's abundant food, it doesn't freeze over, they have much higher survival. Then some of those birds misnavigated on their migrations back to the Canterbury high country lakes and ended up in the Otago lakes and the Hydro lakes and Lake Wakatipu and so forth, where they hadn't been for decades. And they began to breed very successfully. Now there's more than 1,000. And the reason for that is because of the fact that a quarter of the whole population winter on Lake Forsyth, Te Wairua. So from there, they began to breed on some of the rivers that go into Lake Ellesmere and Lake Forsyth, and also in the shingle pits, the Te Water Golf Resort, Lake Rutakahatu, for example, the first time since the 1850s that they've recolonised the lowland areas. And this is a theme that we have here in Christchurch, is that whereas in most of the world, the model is the rural area is the rich environment, and the city is the poorer environment, and wildlife flies into town and gets eaten by cats and dogs. The fact is that we've built our city on the richest environment in Canterbury. Think about Arthur's Pass. All you've got is U-shaped valleys and beach forest, nothing else, riverbeds. Canterbury Plains, it's wheat fields, it's macrocarpa hedges. Christchurch, we have volcanic hilltops, we have Riccarton bush, we have bush forests up on the hills, we have sandy shorelines and rocky shorelines and cliffs, braided rivers, all kinds of wetlands, estuaries, and we're a super, rich environment. And that's why bird populations have always been very high here. That's why Māori settled here, and that's why Pākehā built a settlement here and built a city here. So when we have conservation effort in the city and we protect their wildlife and they increase, they repopulate the rest of the wider area. So the next one is the scaup, the black divey duck that you see. This was a near threatened species, total world population 15,000 about 20 years ago when the first ones bred at Bromley, oxidation ponds in 1993, 1 pair. Within about 6 years, there were 250 pairs breeding because we had a predator-proof predator control project at Bromley, probably arguably New Zealand's most successful mainland island. They were raising 14 or 15 young each pair and not being predated. So they were producing about 2,500 young a year, which were then exported into the wider hinterland. And all of the Canterbury Plains surrounding us, north and south, Lake Ellesmere, Lake Forsyth, have been recolonised by birds that are coming from the duckling factory at Bromley. So the efforts those efforts in Christchurch more than doubled the entire world population. It's one of the few examples on the world where a near-threatened species has reversed its population decline and has increased to such a degree based on urban wetlands rather than some rural or some distant wilderness reserve. And currently, a quarter of the world population are found on Christchurch wetlands, including the Avon River. There's more scaup, until the earthquakes, there were more scaup on the Avon River than all of the West Coast lakes put together. Raw spoonbills. These birds, like many of our birds, have come from Australia. Basically, how it happens is Australia gets wet every now and again. All the birds that live there breed 3 or 4 times. Then it gets dry and there's a drought. And since the last ice ages, that's been a huge pump of wildlife that's radiated out from Central Australia. Most of them are going from the deserts in the interior to the coastal seaboard, which obviously, as you know, is permanently green. But they keep going. They go to Indonesia, to New Guinea, the Solomons, Vanuatu, Tasmania, and New Zealand. And so most of our native birds have come at some stage in the past from Australia, where they colonise and ultimately become their own species. The raw spoonbills first came here about 100 years ago, but became particularly common after the 1940s. to the population in 1980 was 40 in the whole country. Now there's 3,000. And 1,100 of those are on Christchurch wetlands, particularly Lake Ellesmere. We have 5 breeding colonies. And we now have 1% of the entire world population on our Christchurch wetlands. The species that we are particularly important for, and if this thing dies out, the lights of the world might flicker and go dark for a few minutes, as another species is lost, is the spotted shag. A bird that you may not have ever heard of, and a bird that until quite recently no one really cared about because they were so common. Until recently, 75% of the entire planet's population of this bird lived within the boundaries of this district. Then the earthquakes hit. When the earthquakes hit, the coastal breeding colonies were largely destroyed. The ones that remained had 2 years of percussion where there was constant aftershocks, where eggs on a cliff with an earthquake going through were addled and weren't hatching. Also, birds abandoned these vertical 100-metre high oceanic cliffs that were predator-free because mammals couldn't get to them, and they've moved up the bays in the peninsula. And they're now nesting amongst the tussocks, where for the first time in their history, they're being predated by mammals. At the same time, climate change. For some reason, a lot of the spotted shags in the peninsula no longer feed here. They fly about 100 kilometres south and they feed off the coast of Ashburton. Last year, most of the breeding population abandoned nesting and stayed at Ashburton for the whole year and didn't breed. The population in 1996 was 22,000 pairs, which equates to about 60,000 birds. The entire world population was 30,000, of which 22,000 pairs were here. After the quakes, the population dropped by 10,000. Last year, there were 3,000 pairs left. We still support half the world population, but they're falling fast and they're in trouble. It's an endemic species. And it's a species that, if it's gone forever. So we need to be putting effort into preserving this. The pest-free program on Banks Peninsula initially was sort of pivoted toward reducing predators in bush reserves, with the idea that the small number of bush bird species that live on the Banks Peninsula would increase in time, and ultimately we could reintroduce more species. But as this decline in the spotted shag on the coastal cliffs and other seabirds has occurred, part of that pivot has changed, and a lot of that protection work is now going into protecting these coastal cliff areas. There's still work to do, particularly in relation to eliminating the predation and also looking at the islands and rock stacks off the peninsula and trying to remove mammals from those so they can be natural sanctuaries for these kind of birds. So the media team last week asked me what should Christchurch City support for Bird of the Year 2024, and my advice is the spotted shag. In breeding plumage, as you can see, they're pretty impressive looking beasts with a green face and all that colour. So yeah, if I can get you guys to at least be aware of that, then maybe we can get some momentum going there. There you go. Okay, I'll keep going. The other key features that we have. Okay, I'll keep going. In addition to these seabirds, we have 20,000 shorebirds in our city. This is part of the Goldbot flock of the estuary. These include both our native shorebirds and the ones that migrate from Asia and North America. The bird on the left, the greybird's a ryebill, only found in New Zealand, only bird in the world with a bent beak to one side. 4,000 global population. Yesterday, colleagues and I were at Lake Ellesmere censusing them because for about a week, they migrate from Auckland back to the riverbeds through Lake Ellesmere, and typically 1,000 or a quarter of the population is found at the lake this time. But they weren't there yesterday. I have to go back next week, the first time ever. We have no idea why. But all this climate stuff's kind of real. It's not just about recycling stuff and having diesel-powered vehicles. It's also about the manifestation of climate change on our wildlife populations and us being aware of it, having surveillance over it, and then reacting and protecting the stuff that that live in our space that have got nowhere else to live. Migratory birds, we're at the southern limit of the world migration networks. Everywhere north of us, there's turnover where birds are coming in today and going tomorrow, and more coming in the next day. So you can't get a feel for the decline. Only down here at the bottom of the world could we see declines. The bird I just showed a minute ago, the little brown thing is called a sharp-tailed sandpiper from Siberia. In the 1980s, we used to get about 60 of them. Last year, there were only 3. Okay. The bar-tailed gobbler, their most famous one, just going back, that's the route it migrates, Alaska down to New Zealand, back through China, through the Northern Pacific, back to Alaska. They're arriving this week. You can see there, that particular bird left on 30th of August that year and arrived on 7th September. So any day now they'll be here, probably the next 5 or 6 days. We have a number of them that are flagged, that have got bands on them. See the plastic on the leg. That particular bird returned 9 years in a row from China. In China, there was an experiment where they'd reclaimed a huge coastal wetland, and the birds had no food because the whole area was impounded by a big sea dike. So they had an experiment where they purchased cockles and shellfish from commercial growers, took a boat out and dumped them in the sea, forming big piles, trying to see if the shorebirds that were remaining in this small area of mudflat were feeding on them, and they did. They only managed to see a few wild birds that were marked, and the only bird ever seen again to prove that it worked was this guy here. So this guy was in that group. It fed, it survived, it flew to Alaska and bred. It came back to Christchurch several years after. The only proof we have that it actually worked. We have 4 coastal wetlands in the city that meet international importance criteria. We have 4 of the 20 most important wetlands in the country, Lake Ellesmere being number 1 in the country. Only one of those sites is designated as a international flyway site, the Avon Heathcote Estuary. The others all meet what's called Ramsar criteria, which is international importance criterion. At some stage, as time progresses, we should be thinking about trying to get our sites recognised as international wetlands because they meet the criteria in multiple ways. The 4 key sites, the Avon Heathcote Estuary, which had up to 30,000 birds, but numbers have declined in the last 2 or 3 years. A bunch of problems. Avian botulism, the oxidation ponds went toxic for a while, possibly other things, a legacy from the earthquakes, such as recruitment for shellfish that's food for the birds. Brooklands Lagoon, a different story. Brooklands Lagoon is sinking. It's lost a large amount of its surrounding salt marsh habitat, which has meant that the amount of mudflat has doubled in size. So the bird numbers have increased from 2,000 to 10,000 at peak times in Brooklands Lagoon. Lake Forsyth, 8,000 water birds, no mudflat until the lake drops. But at that time, huge numbers come and use the lake. And of course, the crested grebe and other water birds are there as well. And of course, Lake Te Waihora, Lake Ellesmere, 20,000 hectares, highest count ever in New Zealand for wood and birds, 90,000, but typically more about 60,000. It's a super important site. It has multiple colonies of threatened species. It has huge numbers of birds in the non-breeding season that migrate through the lake. The threats to wildlife in Christchurch. The number 1 threat is habitat loss. The number 2 threat is degradation of habitat condition. Stock, pigs, animals, their reserves, fire, people in four-wheel drive vehicles wrecking wetlands, etc. Number 3, avian disease and toxic conditions. We've lost more than 15,000 birds since the earthquakes to avian botulism. We're now facing the potential arrival of avian flu as well. And toxic conditions, oil spills, diesel spills, the oxidation ponds going nasty a few years ago. Disturbance is number 4. There's an amazing amount of disturbance and the shy species are being scared away. And then after that, it's predation. A lot of people's thinking about getting the wildlife back is kill the predators, they'll come back tomorrow. They won't. If predators can't see a habitat birds can't see a habitat that has no predators. They can see a habitat that exists, i.e. there's trees and swampland. They can see, or they can sense the minimal disturbance, good habitat condition, there's food. It's only when they arrive and stay and try to stay, they get eaten, which hasn't often been the case in Christchurch. Predators haven't always been that bad. We've had amazing population increases despite lots of cats in the city. But one of the reasons is because cats exclude rats to a degree, but particularly ferrets, stoats, weasels, and wildcats. Well, in a few environments in New Zealand where those things aren't existing because domestic cats beat them up. Despite the huge numbers of domestic cats, until bird diseases hit, our populations were increasing rapidly. the Scorp, for example, paradise ducks in every second football field. Now, the major issue for wildlife management in Christchurch is to deal with the fact we have large populations of birds moving through our habitats, which are in a mosaic of fragmented habitat, but we have a massive human footprint, which is always increasing. We build a new cycleway, we get a dog walking circuit after hours. We have drones and other activities, and we have to understand ways of managing those. So we have to do things that allow the birds here without getting in the way of the people, and getting the people out of the way of the birds, and that's a really hard task. So we answer that by reserve creation and habitat provision. This is Charlesworth Reserve, 20 years ago, just paddocks, and now it's an amazing wetland that you wouldn't realise was artificial. We have to find ways of improving ways to mitigate and minimise human disturbance and dog disturbance on wildlife. We can use rules and enforcement. There's the dog law coming up shortly, bylaw. We have to manage public access in a way that provides excellent experiences within nature, but we have to keep some areas off limit. We've failed to do that in most of our stormwater basins. In Horswell, for example, we've got cycleways and walkways everywhere, dog walking circuits and bugger all wildlife, apart from Canada geese. We want to provide really good experiences for people in nature, minimising disturbance at the same time through screened walkways, through hides. We want to use education and community outreach. People like me and Paul are famous in the media for sonographs at the end of the day, especially Paul. And we do a lot of habitat restoration work, including particularly with volunteers. We're doing intensive predator control, but some of that predator control is misplaced. The predator control in the key areas where we support threatened species or populations of breeding species is the most important, because they will then export wildlife into the landscape. Just doing predator control in some neighbourhood in town makes people feel happy, but it's not, it's sucking the oxygen out of the room in terms of what we could do where it's needed. This is the Port Hills or Kennedy's Bush billbird factory. Billbirds were unknown in Christchurch 20 years ago, apart from on the hills. We've tripled, probably now quadrupled the number of billbirds in our reserves because of predator control. And we now have billbirds across the city in winter and breeding in a number of woodland areas. They've recolonised Christchurch based on that factory, that chick factory. We do habitat monitoring and we do intensive weed control, because weed and pest control is a key thing for wildlife management. We do regular surveys and some of our data goes back 80 years. We have the most comprehensive bird survey network in Australasia. We work a lot cooperatively with national and international researchers. There's the Godwits, we've banded over 100 here. And about a week later, I got a phone call from a guy in China. They had one of them at the Yalu River mouth, one of our Christchurch birds. The four key things for our wildlife monitoring and our wildlife work is to outcomes monitoring for our programs, our predator control programs, habitat restoration programs. One of the key ways to know that they succeed is through wildlife monitoring, and therefore outcomes are measured. We do state of the environment monitoring for the council, for ECAN, for the government. The council has a legal obligation to maintain and enhance biodiversity, and this is how we at least measure the bird life aspect of it. We do disease and predation surveillance to understand when things are declining and to react quickly. And we do site performance monitoring. We build all these wetlands and forest habitats around the city. Are they working? Are they just ornamental planting using native trees? Or are they actually creating viable habitat? So we monitor to understand that. And we produce a lot of reports, both published papers and also council reports looking at all these aspects. We do network planning. And of course, when you look at this one for the red zone, if you think that you're going to have people on those stand-up surfboards with the paddle, drinking coffee and walking their dogs and lots of wildlife, then you've got to change the picture and insert Canada goose pictures for every single one, because that's all you're going to get. There needs to be little sanctuary zones. There needs to be some thought about wildlife management to make that dream come true. We have this amazing document, gold standard, called the Biodiversity Strategy, but unfortunately, despite the fact that it's populated with incredible ideas, there's not a lot of linkages or funding lines from what's in that strategy, to what happens at the operational level in council. If there were, we would be world leading. Currently, I'm working on a lot of updates of status and conservation needs of avifauna, both for us in Christchurch and for our partners. City Council have more staff, more resources, more experience. So we help our country cousins in terms of detail about bird species present, occurrence, and so forth. And also I'm doing a lot of site lists as well, Akerau Harbour, Littleton Harbour, Travis Wetland, to bring us all up to date with what we have, what our inventories are. And then working on guidelines and advice, management guidelines for reserves around the city. And also looking now at threatened species conservation plans, which fall out of the biodiversity strategy, but we haven't really got a lot in way of operational ability to work on them, but at least in doing those plans for them. The final thing is that ultimately, when we're restored, we've got a habitat in good condition, predators are low, disturbance is minimized, we have pockets of habitat that are sort of have the halo effect and wildlife is moving into the wider city, then we can look at reintroducing what is lost. And this is an example of the brown teal that we did some years ago at Travis. The Tui on Banks Village is another very famous example. But hopefully moving forward, particularly with the red zone, the enormous amount of money is going into the red zone habitat work. We should be able to reintroduce a bunch of species that have become extinct locally that now can survive in Christchurch, but they aren't here because the nearest population is 500 kilometres away. The end.
Right. Now,
thanks.
And you didn't use one note. I'm very impressed.
Had to cut it down for 3 hours.
We do have to be back here at 12, so we're boring into our break, but that doesn't matter. That's important. I'd just sort of be interested to know that paddock that you had at Charlesworth Reserve.
Yeah.
The person that turned it from that paddock into what it is now.
Yeah.
You're looking at it.
Good job.
Because that's when we did a subdivision next door for CDL.
Yeah.
Called I can't remember what it's called, and the council got us to go in there and dig that out so it would turn into what it is today. So I'm very proud of that.
Well, the key thing we've learned is the best weed killer on the planet is called salt water. So what we did with the job that the Mayor's talking about is we just scraped off the grass and we opened up the tide and we allowed the salt to come in, which restored the natural indigenous vegetation. It's not stuff planted from nurseries. It's stuff where there's still a seed source. And in the red zone, for example, with the sea level rise, the earthquakes have made us sink. We're able to do what nature would have done if no one lived here. If there was an earthquake 1 million years ago, then it would have adjusted. And that's what we can do with salt water. And what we have to do is scrape the high ground and recolonize. It's a wonderful example.
Yeah. So we are, my fault for talking. We got two, please. Yanni will have to wait because we're out of time, but Celeste and Aaron.
Thank you. Really interesting. You might be the only person in this room who's been here longer than Yanni. So
I apologise.
Sorry. I've got quite a few questions, so maybe we can have you come back at some point.
Yeah.
But I'll just focus on the Bromley Ponds because you mentioned that. You mentioned that there wasn't any pest management happening currently. What does that mean?
Yeah, we had 20 years of pest management at Bromley. In the last year, it was done by a regional, so Three Waters asset, but regional parks. They don't have the resources currently, and the staff member left. So they're unable to do that work in there. They're doing massive work elsewhere, and Three Waters currently don't have the resources to be able to do that. So that's fully understandable. My job is to advocate for wildlife. It's one of the most important bangs for buck that we can imagine because of the wildlife values there. Resources do need to go in there somehow. We know that when trapping stopped after the quakes for a year because of access, the population of scorp went from about 250 pairs down to about 30 pairs.
So we can pick that up as an action, can we, to report back on?
We can do it tomorrow because we got the water report.
And the other quick one, sorry, I know we're short on time, was around the environmental monitoring of the pond, because obviously we've had a lot of monitoring around other, the social impact and so forth, but is there a mechanism where we can report on the environmental monitoring on the pond and the impact on the bird life? Because it sounds like that's quite an important
Yeah, I think there probably just needs to be a good internal discussion between parks who hold some expertise and Three Waters. Adam's always been very approachable. There's some health and safety issues around access now and other things, but I think just a good, healthy internal debate, we can solve most of this quite easily.
So can I suggest that maybe we put that down as an action as well, as we get a bit more information about?
Where are all these actions going?
Oh, it's just around getting, because we do get updates.
Work program.
Yeah. So
Okay.
that'd be great.
Thank you.
As part of we get wastewater treatment plant reports. So that just be part of that, which we get monthly to the community board, which I think would be helpful. Thank you.
Aaron?
Yeah, just quickly, two things. So, Mr. Mayor, could you wade into the bird of the year debate and kind of on Sarah's point, do a media release saying that encouraging people to vote for the spotted shag? I think it's a good profile for Christchurch. I think it's one of those good stories that would cut through all the media, especially any at the trench that the mayor dug.
We won't mention that.
No, not that one. The one in where was it? Charlesworth Reserve.
Yeah.
Is there none there?
Yeah, most of these birds are sitting on actual unknown bit of council land, which is the coastal legal road that goes around almost the whole of the peninsula.
Right.
So
okay. So that's one. And then the other is I've learnt more about birds today than probably in my entire life. I'd seriously like us to explore making some sort of film, whether how it's used or obviously short, but getting this information across that can play around through all the schools in Christchurch and Canterbury. This is something we should all be champions of and know more about. So whether we do that in-house or through someone, but if we could look into that, Mary, somehow.
It ties in with the dog consultation.
Yeah,
as
exactly.
well.
And then people go, actually, I need my dog on a lead. Because
Okay,
of the damage I can do. So
good point.
Okay,
thank you very much. And I'm totally blown away by your
My note was one day to prepare, wasn't it? It was asked for.
What this really shows is the value of monitoring. I mean, Andrew's been doing this since he was a snotty nose.
I think he's talked about it before. I might be wrong.
Yeah, being able to get this data is vital. So that value of monitoring to tell the story.
Yeah.
If you don't monitor, you can't tell the story.
Excellent. But we need to get it out there so a whole lot of other people can see it. So thank you very much. 12 o'clock, guys. See you back here.